Happy Easter. Welcome, everyone, to the North Texas Church of Freethought. This is our weekly Zoom meeting. It's April 9th, 2023. You may be watching this on YouTube or elsewhere afterwards, so it might not be Easter Sunday anymore, but it is right now as we're recording this. So we'll get to that in a moment. We've been around since 1994. It'll be 30 years next year. We meet by Zoom every Sunday since the pandemic began, but we sometimes have presentations. I would say more often than not, or at least half the time. The first Sunday of the month, though, we do meet in person in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. That's where we're located. You can sign up for our e-newsletters at the bottom of every page on our website, and you see the URL there, the website address. Go there, sign up, and you'll get our weekly notices as to what we're doing and if we have a change of the physical meeting space and so on. So what is the North Texas Church of Freethought? Well, we're atheists. Okay, sure. I mean, that's what other people would call us, although I personally don't go around thinking about that. Everybody's an atheist in one sense or another about one deity or another. Non-theism is another term that seems more attractive to some people than atheism. And there's humanism and rationalism and lots of other terms. But the main thing is that we are supernaturalism free. None of us are going to have any patience with accounts of ghosts and so forth, unless it's a movie and we know it's imaginary, and that can be a lot of fun. We are not into dogmas. We're not into doctrines. There's nothing you have to believe if you're a free thinker, and it's how and why in what manner you believe that's important and not what you believe. We're not out to believe things. In fact, we would rather err on the side of not believing in anything than in believing what is wrong. And because we've taken out these parts of traditional religion, we have in the past also called ourselves a filet religion, taken out those hard bones. And I'm after all, if you're going to have a nice, delicious piece of fish, you would like to have the bones out of there before you swallow it. Here's what we are about as opposed to what we're not about, and that is facts and reason. Now, we've talked before about there being different kinds of facts and reason. There's the fact of how that steak tastes to you. That's not a fact that science can really do much with other than register what you say about it. And reasoning it's hard to define, and we've talked about that too. A lot of times it's just putting two and two together, as they say. 2 and 2 makes 4, but a lot of things you put together are not 2 and 2. So how about elephants and shrimp? How do you put those together? Well, you might find a way to put those together. They probably have all kinds of genetic things in common and so on. Our church is also about subjectivity. So that's what it is, the taste of steak as compared to the chemical composition of it. And so this has to do with the private and personal dimension of the human condition, of the human experience, of qualia, our emotions. And I'm not talking about silly emotions like the anger that overcomes you without your wanting to. That's actually a problem. We don't want to have emotions coming into our lives unbidden, but we do like to feel that sense of awe and wonder when we contemplate the universe, and also just appreciation for others in our lives that we love, our connections with others, and that's what our church is about as well, community and connecting with others and seeing what our ideas mean to them, if anything. Our opinions about religion, that is our religion. We are reinventing religion in that sense. We're rescuing religion from the other things, the dogmas and doctrines and superstitions. At one time, of course, it was reasonable to suppose there was spooky things in the world, but not any longer. I mean, you got to go to quantum mechanics and people try to make that spooky, but that's not really spooky either. We want to restore religion to being something personal, having to do with personal codes and personal integrity. That's what we're doing. Remember, there is no meaning or value in or of life without it being your meaning and value. When people talk about meaning and value, always remember that. Whose meaning and value are they talking about? Some supernatural deity who's going to smash you if you don't agree and love him? How ridiculous. Finding our value and meaning ourselves is not only something we can do, but something we must do because no one else can do it. No one else can do it but us. Here are our principles. reason, make sense of things, enjoyment, because we do wish to pursue happiness. We'd rather eat that juicy steak than, well, choose whichever thing you hate most in life as far as a meal. Appreciation, which is not just enjoyment, it's that deep emotional connection and sense of gladness about what you have, even though there may be things you'd like to have that you don't. And love, which is the meaning and purpose. I will remind you that Freethought is not free. What we do costs some money, so please do visit our website, not only to sign up for the e-newsletter, but you can donate on any page through PayPal. We very much depend on your continued support. And on YouTube, if you're watching this on YouTube later, please subscribe, ring the bells, and do these other things. And give us a comment. Let us know where you think we go right and where you think we go wrong, or what you'd like to see more of or less of. We very much depend on your feedback, too. Remember, our Church of Freethought is about you, not about some doctrines and dogmas and some supernatural beastie. So, back to today's holiday. Blood, gore, and zombies. You thought that was Halloween, but no, it's Easter. Easter falls on a different date every year, though. Why is that? Because Easter is an astrological holiday. It's linked to the lunar month and seasonal changes, and not to any historical event that occurred on a specific date like other holidays. Easter is the first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox. So, as the spring equinox is typically March 21st or 22nd, March 22nd is pretty much the earliest that Easter can happen. Last time it fell on March 22nd was in 1818. And that won't happen again until 2285. And since a lunar cycle, a month, is 29 and a half days, April 25th is the latest date that Easter can occur. That last happened in 1943, and it won't happen again until 2038. The Christian holiday of Easter was likely originally a pagan fertility festival held in the spring and centered around the Anglo-Saxon goddess of the same name, though often spelled E-O-S-T-R-E, as you see there, and that's her on the upper left, artist's rendition. Remember, the spelling was not standardized in the olden days. Even today, in jolly old England, words like theater, fiber, center, and liter are spelled with a T-R-E at the end, not a T-E-R. The more sensible American spelling is, and we discussed it last year in the service on words, thanks to Noah Webster, the guy that made the American Dictionary. So the spelling of Easter doesn't really mean anything other than the name of that fertility goddess. It's the same. This idea of the origins of Easter also has old roots. In the late 7th and early 8th century, there was a monk named Bede. You see him there at the bottom right, a little drawing, also known as Saint Bede or the Venerable Bede. He's often considered the father of English history because of his work, Ecclesiastical History of the English People, believed to have been written, or at any rate finished, in 731. In that work, Bede says that Easter is named for the pagan fertility goddess. He also cited a letter of Pope Gregory I, who lived from 540 to 604, so a bit before Bede came along, where the Pope recommended that Christian missionaries link pagan holidays to and thereby displace them with Christian observances. And of course, the Bible, at least the Gospel, I think more than one of the Gospels. I had to go back and research that again, but it's crucifixion and resurrection is linked to Passover, and that tends to be in the spring, although it's variable in the Jewish calendar. So it's generally accepted that from the beginning, Christians observed every Sunday as the Day of the Lord, commemorating the resurrection of Jesus. But the first mention of an annual or anniversary celebration is not until the late 2nd century. Even now, the precise date of the crucifixion and resurrection are not known. That is strange, isn't it? Bishop Ussher, who famously determined the exact date and time when God created the world, wasn't sure whether the crucifixion and resurrection were in 32 or 33 CE. You can use the Jewish calendar for either of those years to figure out when Passover would have been, and that gives something like April 3rd of 33 CE for the date of the crucifixion, which would make the resurrection, of course, April 5th of that year, but I don't remember ever Christians jumping up and down on April 5th. They just pay no attention to that date. Seems strange that the date of resurrection has been in such doubt, since, according to the Gospels, lots of people knew of this event, which would surely have been considered, and is now considered by billions of Christians, to be the most stupendous event of history. Surely the 12 apostles, well, 11 without Judas, and many more disciples and followers who knew of it firsthand would have marked the date and observed its very first anniversary the following year and every year afterwards. After all, the resurrection is the central doctrine of Christianity. That alone should make it the most stupendous thing that has ever happened or will ever happen. The Apostle Paul said that if it didn't happen, quote, then is our preaching vain and your faith is also vain. That's amazing, isn't it? If there was no resurrection, then all that stuff about loving your neighbor is worthless. In addition, we know for a certain fact, because the Gospel of Matthew says so, that when Jesus died, that moment the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. Bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. How about that from Matthew? Now, there's three things about this. First, the other three Gospels, Mark, Luke, and John, don't mention any of this. You would think if these things really happened that they would all mention it. Gospels certainly do repeat each other on many less important things. Indeed, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are known as the synoptics because they see together, synoptics. They consist of many of the same stories and sayings. Second, we know that death is not something that happens in a moment when, poof, someone gives up their spirit. In fact, death is to some degree reversible. With 21st century methods, people can be restored to life within several minutes of cardiac arrest. And you may say, well, cardiac arrest is not dead. You may have other requirements. Maybe you have to be dead for 10 minutes or an hour, or your body has to cool to room temperature or whatever. But, even after all of that, the organs remain viable for transplant. Muscle tissue remains viable for a few hours. Bone and skin cells can survive for several days. Viable stem cells have been extracted from dead human bodies at least 17 days after death. I'm not aware whether they've tried for longer than that. And in mice, they've been able to take dead mice and extract viable stem cells 14 days after death. And when put into living mice, these cells seem to work just fine. Thirdly, look at that last sentence. Read it carefully now. And tell me that the clause after Jesus' resurrection wasn't inserted later. Because why would this business of tombs breaking open and dead people coming out alive again, a literal zombie apocalypse, why would these be mentioned as happening right after the earthquakes and rocks splitting if it didn't actually happen until a couple of days later? Or did the resurrected holy people they must have just kind of hung out in their tombs, watched some Netflix or something until Jesus came out? No, I think it's likely that someone obviously thought that it would be unseemly if anyone else had been resurrected before Jesus. The Gospel of John's resurrection of Lazarus had not been written yet when Matthew wrote, but instead of a rewrite of the whole episode, someone pretty early on just inserted those three words. Now, for a long time, Christians got away with claiming that the Gospels are historical records. Clearly, they are anything but. Even though this claim is still made and readily accepted, people just eat it up. The Gospels mention some historical events and people to situate the stories, but the Gospels are devotional, not historical in their nature, purpose, and meaning. There's nothing wrong with that, but they're not historical. There were other people in those times, identifiable people, writing in their own names that gave accounts of events they knew of, including the existence of Christians. But none of them mentioned the resurrection. None of them described Jesus' ministry and his many miracles. None of them mentioned the implausible Roman census that supposedly required everyone to return to their place of birth to register. None of them mentioned the atrocity of the slaughter of the innocents supposedly ordered by King Herod soon after Jesus was born. All these things would have been noticed and taken note of at the time, but they're nowhere to be found outside of the Gospels. Those people you see there, Josephus, the first one, he's really probably the main source of historical information about this time period, even though he was born after Jesus' supposed crucifixion and resurrection. But it's thought that the material in Josephus is actually an insertion, and Origen complained that as Josephus was not a Christian, he didn't didn't plug the Jesus story, didn't contain add much information. Pliny the Elder and the Younger were also writing about this time. The Younger, at least, wrote about the existence of Christians, and so did Tacitus and Suetonius. But I mean, big deal. We know there are Christians. The question is, was their faith, was their religion actually based on the existence of a real person or the events that are described in the Gospels? And of course, all those dead people coming out of their graves and wandering around at the time of Jesus' crucifixion or after Jesus' resurrection, nothing in the historical records about that. And what happened to all those undead people anyway? Did they live out normal lives and then die again, or are they still around because they were resurrected in new resurrected bodies, right? Or did they ascend into heaven when Jesus did, raptured, as it were, or what? Clearly, like the curtain tearing, the earthquakes, and the rock splitting, which are also nowhere mentioned by other writers of the time, these are obviously no more than narrative props to add drama and excitement. They're like the special effects without which there could be no Hollywood blockbusters. Much of the Bible reads this way, like comic books, not at all like serious history. Yet this and many other examples are evidence that never seems to demand any kind of verdict so far as believers are concerned. We could go on and on just with the crucifixion and resurrection business. Dan Barker, co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation up in Madison, Wisconsin, wonderful organization, and if you're not a member, you should join now, today. He has an Easter challenge that no one so far has been able to satisfactorily answer, and it's a simple request, says Barker. Tell me exactly what happened, without omitting a single detail, on the day that Christians' most important doctrine was born. Well, of course, it can't be done. Not without resorting to these excuses, like the Gospels were based on oral traditions which changed as they were told and retold. So, each Gospel had a little different version. Well, I mean, come on, we knew that these oral traditions are like the telephone game. Biblical scholar and former fundamentalist Christian Bart Ehrman points this out all the time, though you would think that if the events of the resurrection could be so subject to variation that less important events could get even more confused. But then, out of the other side of their mouths, devout Christians claim that the Gospels were actually written by or dictated to others by Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John themselves, who were eyewitnesses to everything. Plus, all of the canon was supposedly composed under divine inspiration, and that would exclude any possibility of anyone misremembering or making any mistakes. Then there are excuses like the details don't matter. Really? Would that be said of any of the other scattered verses of the New Testament, on the details of which all sorts of doctrines and dogmas like hating LGBT people are rigidly based? And look, they say, if one account says one thing and another account says another thing, then obviously both of them happen and each account is just focusing on one or the other thing. At least one apologist offers the excuse that in Bible times paper and ink were scarce, so each gospel had to leave many things out. They knew, say the apologists, that the things they left out are mentioned elsewhere anyway. You see how this works? Matthew, Mark, and Luke left things out that they knew were in John, which hadn't even been written yet. So this is why the evangelists could only give heavily truncated and pared down versions of what, and remember, this is supposed to be the most stupendous event of history. Yes, loaves and fishes can be miraculously multiplied without limit, but not paper and ink. Of course, none of that makes any kind of sense in the real world. None of that is acceptable practice in open and honest inquiry. None of that holds up in any kind of serious effort to present and understand the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Now, if you've never read Thomas Paine's classic, The Age of Reason, let me urge you to do so. We often think of Thomas Paine as just being the guy whose thought and writings, like Common Sense and The American Crisis, provided the rationale and motivation for the American colonists to make their break with Britain and King George III. And, of course, he did do those things. But Age of Reason, published in 3 parts, in 1794, 1795, and 1807, was a critical analysis of the Bible. Paine was a deist, as were many intelligent people at that time. The Age of Reason was a bestseller in the early nation. It also contributed to the gradual growth of biblical criticism that had been hesitantly underway for only a little more than a century. Before then, it was not safe to express doubts about the infallibility of the Bible. It was hazardous to even question the belief that Moses wrote the whole Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, including Deuteronomy's description of Moses' own death and burial. Yet Thomas Paine had this to say about contradictions and inconsistencies in the Bible. I lay it down as a position which cannot be controverted. First, that the agreement of all the parts of a story does not prove that story to be true, because the parts may agree and the whole may be false. Secondly, that the disagreement of the parts of a story proves the whole cannot be true. The agreement does not prove truth, but the disagreement proves falsehood positively. And that makes eminent sense. In fact, there's also a legal principle that applies here. Falsus in uno, falsus in omnibus, which is false in one thing, false in everything. Now, this is not a rigid and certainly not a mandatory rule in legal proceedings, but it expresses the obvious wisdom of being suspicious of anything and everything a witness may say if any part of their testimony is not truthful, right? We've all seen these courtroom shows. And in the notorious 11-month murder trial of O.J. Simpson in 1994 and 1995, for example, Judge Lance Ito instructed the jury that, quote, a witness who is willfully false in one material part of his or her testimony is to be distrusted in others. So where does that leave us with respect to the efforts of Christians to maintain that Easter is all about and only about the resurrection of Jesus, just as Christmas is insisted to be all about and only about the birth of Jesus? By the way, you see there are about 9 months that separate Easter from Christmas, and it's also claimed, at least it has in the past by some Christians, that Jesus was conceived on Easter and then born on Christmas, and then, of course, years later, crucified and resurrected at that year. Well, where all this should leave us is that it should cause us to doubt all the Gospels and everything in them as historical documents. They could mean anything you want otherwise. In fact, it should cause us to doubt even the existence of Jesus as one single specific historical person. And this idea has been seriously and quite cogently advanced. Many people have written about the historical Jesus, trying to figure out who he was, and nobody's been able to really come up with anything. But the people who argue for Jesus never having actually existed as a real historical person are called mythicists. mythicists. Now, the choice is not between accepting orthodox, fundamentalist, every word of the Bible is true, or rejecting everything as a complete fabrication or a lie. But we do know that in the late 1st or early 2nd century, some version of the mythicist idea was already in circulation, since the 2nd epistle of Peter, which no one knows who wrote it, but likely not Peter, has it that we did not follow cleverly devised fables. This is an interesting denial in an epistle attributed to Peter. Nobody really knows, though, who wrote it, as I said. Because when his disciples asked why he spoke in parables in Matthew 13, Jesus replies, this is the words of Jesus, because it is given unto you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it is not given. Speak I to them in parables, because they seeing see not, and hearing they hear not, neither do they understand. Oh, this sounds like what a lot of believers today would say when they come up against doubters and skeptics who won't accept what they have to say. And here we see why many have linked early Christianity to that of the mystery religions of the time, or even the Jewish version of a mystery religion. The point is, for all we know, that some of the earliest Christians may well have understood their faith as cleverly devised fables. Not in a pejorative sense, of course, but rather in the sense of profound truths disguised as ordinary, if somewhat puzzling, messages. In other words, some early Christians, and remember, they were still Jews at that point, so Christianity was supplemental to their Judaism, they may have understood the gospel stories as special revealed truths of the supernatural expressed in seemingly ordinary terms. Remember, Jesus was always talking about the kingdom of heaven being like this and like that. So maybe to them it was the equivalent of Buddhist koans, such as the famous "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" Nothing wrong with that, by the way. The Gospels as a whole, and not just the individual stories in them, may be intended to be read in this way, for their deeper meaning. This is particularly suggested by the structure of the Gospel of Mark, which is also, perhaps not coincidentally, this is the oldest Gospel. Previously, Mark was just thought to have been a bad writer. But for the last 100 years, scholars have studied what Mark's use of what is called interpretive intercalation, also known as the Markan sandwich. This is a literary technique of nesting narratives within each other in such a way as to make a theological point. Look this up on your own. It's a big subject. And consider that, however suitable that this may be for a devotional composition, it's not the way to report on historical events. So mythicism need not be understood as the claim that Christianity and the Gospels on which it is based are just complete fabrications, much less that they are lies invented in order to deceive people. That's just not what myths are. It's not where they come from. We may never know just how Christianity began, but it seems certain that it began within Judaism and became one of several sects of Judaism by the mid to late 1st century. These were tumultuous times in this strategic area of the world at the junction of 3 continents. Think of this. The Romans had invaded and conquered Palestine in 63 BCE. With this came Greek and Roman cultural influences, as well as the loss of the expectation that Judaism and its traditions would ever again become ascendant. No wonder that many people in the area considered it the end times and looked for leaders to deliver them. No wonder that the Romans had difficulties in subduing and pacifying the Jews, from among whom new leaders continually arose to stage their revolts. For their part, the Roman occupiers routinely executed, typically by crucifixion, rebels and other troublemakers, often in large numbers at one time. In 4 BCE, the Roman general Varus crucified, according to Josephus, remember he lived not that much later, 37 to 100, quote, about 2,000, unquote, Jews. As the 1st century wore on, there were additional such mass crucifixions, on one occasion of a multitude not to be enumerated, and on another, according to Josephus, quote, about 3,600, unquote, including women, children, and even infants. I mean, look at that bottom right picture. You got a whole line of crucifixes. Typically, we see the crucifixion depicted as 3 little crosses on a hill. No, even that picture down at the bottom there, how many are there? Maybe 20? Think of 50 times that, just to be into the thousands. Ridiculous. I mean, how do you even imagine that? Hard to imagine the impression it must have made on people when these things happened, and then afterwards, as the bodies were left to rot before being thrown into mass graves. These struggles continued for decades, eventually leading to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, on which the Jewish religion centered, and that was in the year 70 CE. But there were then, as there have always been, people who scoured writings they considered sacred, the scriptures they fervently believed had been authored by the all-powerful and all-knowing creator deity of everything, a God that would never fail to care for his chosen people. And guess what? Those people found in what we now call the Old Testament prophecies of a coming Messiah. This Messiah would be descended from King David, would be born to a virgin in Bethlehem, would defeat the devil and rule over an eternal kingdom, among other things. But strangely, this Messiah would also be, quote, made lower than the angels, unquote, would be a stumbling block, would be, quote, a trap and a snare, as well as, quote, despised and rejected, a man of suffering and familiar with pain, and, quote, held in low esteem, quote, a suffering servant, unquote, who will also be, quote, exalted and extolled. Now, all of these prophecies, somewhat confusing, agreed. In their contexts, they never meant what this early Jewish proto-Christian movement said they meant. But if you read Isaiah, you will see, too, that it is something of a Rorschach. We do know that the virgin business comes out of a mistranslation, and things like the suffering servant seem to have referred to the nation of Israel as a whole. But you see, none of that really matters, because these prophecies could mean what people had always thought they meant or might mean, and they could also be read as prophecies of the coming Messiah. Like some song lyrics, the vagueness and ambiguities makes them more appealing to the people of the time and even people today. If something could mean something long ago, but now also means something to you, that's divine. Clearly, these scriptural passages figure very heavily in the Gospels, which strive to show that Jesus fulfilled all these supposed prophecies of the Messiah that no one previously had even known were prophecies. Few people seem to care very much about them today, especially with all the miracles Jesus was said to have worked. What do you need all those prophecies for? They're all pretty questionable anyway, but as said already, the Gospels came later. Remember, too, that at times the very thing that people blurt out in an unguarded moment, particularly in informal settings, comes closer to the truth. And they might have reason to believe that what they're saying will be widely disseminated or preserved, or when they're revising their work later, they may take more care with what they say. The earliest writings of Christianity are the 7 authentic letters of Paul. In fact, these are the only parts of the New Testament, or indeed of any part of the Bible, that we know with any confidence who wrote them. And if you put out of your mind everything else about Christianity and focus just on these documents, a very different sort of Jesus emerges than that depicted in the Gospels. Because Paul never talks about Jesus' earthly ministry, his teachings, his miracles, or even the specific events of the resurrection, such as the earthquakes, rock splitting, all the zombies, how the alleged empty tomb was discovered, doubting Thomas, and all of that. Oh, the Gospels all repeat each other, but Paul doesn't repeat hardly anything in the Gospels. In fact, the only thing that he ever mentions in terms of passages, he does quote a lot of passages from the Old Testament, including the prophecies of the coming Messiah, but there's nothing of the "He gets us, Jesus" ad campaign in the writings of Paul. The only key event of Jesus' ministry that Paul mentions is the Last Supper. But Paul's account of it suggests that he was there when we know he wasn't. He relates it as what he puts it, received from the Lord, unquote, including direct quotes of Jesus. How can that be? Paul doesn't say that he got it from others who were there, the 12 apostles minus Judas. He never says, oh, Peter told me or whatever. So Paul could only have gotten what he says about the Last Supper in a vision or other personal revelation from Jesus, much as televangelists today say they get, quote, a word from the Lord, unquote. Gospel accounts had not yet been written when Paul wrote his letters. But even if they were circulating as oral traditions, Paul seems not to know anything about them. Even when it relates to the subject he's dealing with or would drive home his point, he doesn't mention them. For example, when in Romans 13, Paul is urging his followers not to rebel against, but to obey the authorities, he doesn't quote Jesus' famous "render unto Caesar" remark. Why? Would have been perfect. Well, we don't know why. Apologists claim that Paul never refers to these things because he knew that other people already know all about them. But they don't know that. Paul talks about plenty of things that others already knew about. Paul quotes from the Old Testament, as I said, and it's not as if he takes any pains not to be repetitive, but it certainly could be that at the time Paul was writing that there was not yet a historical Jesus. Here's Paul in his letter to the Philippians, one of the earliest letters. That's who, being in the form of, he's talking about Jesus, being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation. So at the beginning there, he's talking about Jesus as a pre-existent being, and then he made himself of no reputation, took upon himself the form of a servant, and remember, that often means slave in the Bible, and was made in the likeness of men. And being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. So the absence of a historical Jesus, that somebody knew who it was, certainly is consistent with this passage, which Paul summarizes the mindset of Jesus. Paul believes that Jesus was a real person, but a person of no reputation and a servant. This view of Jesus is clearly not that he was a complete fiction, at least not as we now think of complete fiction. Remember, people had scoured the Jewish scriptures and found all of these prophecies. By the time of Paul, thousands upon thousands of Jews had been crucified by the Romans and what was left of their bodies thrown into mass graves. But now who is to say that any one of them had not been the suffering servant promised by God? If Yahweh is truly in control of everything and loves his chosen people and has planned all along to send the Messiah, then it must be indeed, it cannot fail to be, that one of those victims of the crucifixions had to be, let me repeat, had to be Jesus Christ, whose death redeemed all humanity. And if you don't believe that, then you don't have sufficient faith. Or seeing you see not, and hearing you hear not, or you're deluded by Satan. See how that works? So then what about all the people who saw the risen Jesus? What is that all about? Well, Paul's famous encounter on the road to Damascus. Here's Drawing of that, that was a vision. In Acts 9, the story is told in the third person, and it is said that those traveling with Paul stood speechless, hearing a voice but seeing no man. Then in Acts 22, we get the story again. This time, Paul himself is telling the story, but this time his companions, as he says, saw indeed the light and were afraid, but they heard not the voice. There's no other first-person account of anyone seeing the risen Jesus, either in the flesh or as a vision. This is really the only eyewitness testimony we have that is claimed to be in the New Testament. But if Paul could have such an encounter as he had, so could others. I mean, Paul came later, right, as he says, calls himself untimely born. Paul never says otherwise. He never says, oh, these other people were encountered Jesus in the flesh. For all we know, all the encounters with Jesus were visions. And after all, that is commonly how people then and now interact with supernatural beings. Now, we can well suppose how non-Christians, those who were not persuaded to convert, may have responded to the ideas and claims of these early Jewish proto-Christians. They would have been skeptical. They would have said that other people having visions meant nothing to them. They would have said that a Messiah that came anonymously and lived humbly with no reputation and died among the many victims of Roman mass crucifixions to save humanity from sin and death, that was just ridiculous. And they would have been embarrassing and frustrating to those early Jewish proto-Christians. They would tell this story in earnest, and then they would be completely frustrated. It would have given them strong motivation, these early proto-Christians, to come up with more specific claims about who Jesus was, and especially what he said and did while he was alive. And more specific claims would obviously help them win more converts. Maybe the visions that people were having of the risen Jesus supplied the sort of details that became the Gospels. Remember, they put a lot of emphasis on things back then, dreams too. Maybe the most zealous of the Jewish proto-Christians came to feel certain about how it must have been. They already had got that idea of the Messiah coming and being crucified and being resurrected, and they knew he was resurrected because they could see him in their visions. Maybe some of them came up with stories, and perhaps these were clever, nested narratives meant to convey profound truths while seeming on the surface to be simple stories. And maybe it could even be that some of them figured that the ends of getting more converts justified the means of giving people what they wanted in the way of a more fully fleshed out, pun intended, version of the Messiah. What is more plausible or implausible concerning the origins of Christianity? Orthodox fundamentalism of today's doctrines, of the literal truth and infallibility of the fantastic stories of the New Testament with its obvious plot holes, inconsistencies, miracles, zombie apocalypse, and so on? Or that Christianity began with scouring the Old Testament for solutions to an existential crisis of Judaism, finding clues pointing towards a promised Messiah, drawing the conclusion rooted in absolute faith in God that such promises had in fact been fulfilled. Remember, even the Jehovah's Witnesses believed that Christ had come again. The second coming happened, but it was invisible, like last in the 19th century. And then, of course, those early proto-Christians could just continue filling in the blanks as needed with visions and ideas of how it had to have happened. So the first option is clearly false. The second may be false also. The second stands a much better chance of being possibly, maybe, how it could have happened. And there are many examples of how religions get started in this way. There are, of course, other possibilities, including what Bart Ehrman has suggested, that Jesus was a real person, an itinerant preacher who ran afoul of the authorities, got himself crucified, and then later was deified. But that leaves puzzling questions, especially why Paul doesn't seem to know anything about that Jesus. How the vicarious atonement theology of Paul became attached to the failed career of an itinerant Jewish preacher seems a little odd. The question of the historicity of Jesus and the origins of Christianity, very topical this time of year, of course. It is a fascinating subject, but it is also enormous and complicated, not only by its connections to other subjects, such as the other mystery religions of the Greco-Roman world, and especially by the strong feelings of many non-Christians. We have them, yes, and the even stronger, far stronger feelings of Christians who feel embattled by any and all efforts to question their orthodoxy. And after all, they don't want the rug pulled out from under them. All we ask is, leave us alone for the most part. Many believing scholars in academia, you have to remember too, are at institutions where they have to sign and abide by statements of faith. So their livelihood depends on their orthodox Christian views. There is a lot of further reading that anyone interested in these subjects can pursue. You see some of it up there, including works by, as mentioned, Bart Ehrman, and for various forms of mythicism, writers such as G.A. Wells. That was the first book in this genre that I read years ago. Also, Earl Doherty, Robert M. Price, and Richard Carrier. Richard Carrier tends to be kind of sarcastic and likes to make fun of the Jesus myth idea, but I think a more sympathetic reading is more along the lines of what I've just presented to you. Remember, though, you don't have to believe in something in order to get an honest grasp of it or to understand it. And as we've said many times, understanding other people and being understood ourselves, that's very much more important than believing in stuff and having faith and this nonsense that religion is too much connected to. So please think about that. A few things that happened on April 9th that I thought were interesting. In 1609, Philip III issued a decree that expelled the Moriscos from Spain. Now, the Moriscos were Muslims that had been forced to convert to Christianity, their descendants, and I guess they felt pretty threatened with the wars that were going on at the time, so he kicked them all out of Spain. Religion related for sure. 1784, the Treaty of Paris. That's the one that ended the American Revolution. That was finally ratified by George III on April 9th that year. 1860, the French inventor Edouard Leon Scott de Martinville, he made the oldest known recording of a human voice. How about that? Before Thomas Edison, he had made this little device and made a recording of a human voice. First time ever. In 1865, on this date, Robert E. Lee surrendered with his Army of Northern Virginia to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox, Virginia. And in 1967, our own Sam Harris, famous atheist writer, philosopher, at his birthday, April 9th. Please go and check out our website. Visit us on our Facebook page. We're also on Twitter and, of course, our YouTube channel. This will be up there later today, but we have lots of other videos there, very much well worth watching, and some of the things I've talked about today refer to those earlier presentations, so it all has to do with everything else. So visit us there's the Facebook and Twitter addresses, our own website, and remember that our church does depend on your continued support. This is important. You can support your values by supporting the North Texas Church of Freethought, because as with so many other things in life, we can do together what none of us can do on our own, and we are stronger together. Join us in promoting facts and reason. Help us celebrate doubt. We should doubt. That's how we get to new ideas, new insights, by doubting the old ones and replacing the ideas that we have for better ones. Demonstrate your commitment by being the future that you wish to see. With that, I will thank you again and good morning. And our little slogan, Malleus Facet, do better. Just like I said, replacing your ideas with better ones to the degree that you're able to do so. And with that, we will move on to question and answer and discussion.